take a deep breath and relax. Let your body soften into stillness. The room around you fades into quiet. The noise of the day melts away like mist in morning sun. Now let your eyelids grow heavy, your breathing slow and steady. Because tonight we travel gently into the scented shadows of the 16th century, to a world of silks, powders, lace, and the queen who ruled it all. Our story begins in the quiet hush of the royal chambers at Richmond Palace, where the perfume is thick, the air cool with damp stone, and the morning begins not with soap and water, but with cloth, powder, and ritual. It's still dark outside. The year is 1595. The chambermaids rise before dawn, padding across the floor in woolen stockings, trying not to wake the queen. Their breath clouds in the cold air as they quietly begin their work. The hearth embers are low, the floors slick with chill, but the queen's bed is warm, high, heavy, wrapped in velvet and linen, with embroidered curtains pulled tight around it like a cocoon. In a few hours she rises to meet ministers, scribes, and courtiers. But for now her body rests, cocooned in gowns and fragrance, layered not in cleanliness as we know it, but in the careful art of concealment. Queen Elizabeth I did not bathe often. Few in her time did. Bathing, true bathing, where the body is immersed in water, was believed to be dangerous, especially for women. Physicians warned that water opened the pores, allowing disease to seep in. Clean skin was vulnerable. It needed covering, not exposure. And so, for most people in Tudor England, cleanliness meant linens, clean linen shifts, clean handkerchiefs, clean ruffs and collars. Water was for faces, perhaps hands, but not bodies. Not unless one was sick, or very, very rich. And the queen was very rich indeed. Still, she did not bathe often. Once a month, perhaps, if she was feeling indulgent. Sometimes less. There is a record of one ambassador asking about her bathing habits, to which she replied softly and confidently, "I bathe once a month, whether I need it or not." And in her world, that was enough. But make no mistake, Elizabeth was fastidious. She was precise. She was obsessed with image, scent, and presence. Her morning routine was not one of rushing water and scrubbing soap, but of powders and oils, of scented gloves and fine combs, of lace handkerchiefs gently pressed to the skin. The queen did not clean her body, she curated it. As the chambermaids finish preparing the table, they lay out delicate cloths, silver brushes, and bowls of rose water. The scent is strong, floral, sharp, slightly metallic. Not quite the rose we know today, but heavier, infused with vinegar and cloves. This rose water is her cleanser, her toner, her defense against both smell and sin. It will be used to dab her face, freshen her hands, wipe her lips. One cloth per area, folded neatly, never reused. Each dipped and wrung and dabbed in practiced silence. They also prepare her gloves. Dozens of pairs, each perfumed with ambergris, civet, musk, and rose. These are not just accessories. They are part of her hygiene. Gloves keep the hands scented, the skin smooth, the presence pleasant. In court, when she lifts her fingers to gesture, the scent trails behind like an invisible veil. People speak of it for hours afterward. She smelled like heaven, they say, not realizing that heaven for Elizabeth was made of fermented whale vomit, musk gland secretions, and crushed petals from Italian roses. Her teeth are a different matter. Elizabeth loved sweets. candied violets, sugar-dusted almonds, marzipan shaped like swans. By her later years, her teeth were famously blackened and decayed. Still, she insisted they be scrubbed daily with cloth and a powder made of crushed eggshells, charcoal, and vinegar. Sometimes she used a twig, other times a small sponge on a stick. Her breath, we imagine, was not fresh, but she masked it with sprigs of rosemary and mint chewed quietly behind the fan as courtiers bowed. When Elizabeth finally rises, she does so slowly. The curtains are drawn back, the fire is built up, and the ladies-in-waiting surround her like a ritual procession. First, they help her remove the nightgown linen, fine but stained. Beneath it, her shift is slightly yellowed, the skin beneath pale and perfumed. They bring warm cloths soaked in herbs, lavender, sage, chamomile, and press them to her chest, underarms, neck, and feet. This is cleansing by Tudor standards. The cloth absorbs. The herbs refresh. The queen is restored. Powder follows. White lead mixed with vinegar and sometimes crushed pearls. It covers her face, her neck, sometimes even her hands. It is poisonous, but beautiful. It hides blemishes, evens tone, gives her that ghostly radiance we see in her portraits. Then rouge, cinnabar, vermilion, or crushed beetle shells is dabbed on her cheeks. A pale face, flushed just enough. The signature of health, even if false. Her hair is brushed and brushed and brushed again, sometimes with a mixture of honey and oil, sometimes dry. Her wigs are warmed beside the fire. Her scalp is powdered to keep away lice. This powder, too, is fragrant clove, orris root, dried lavender. Courtiers might speak of her scent long after she passed a corridor. It was part of her rule, her identity. Elizabeth smelled like power. The queen sits now before her mirror. Not a modern one, clean and reflective, but a dull piece of polished metal bronze, perhaps, with only the faintest shimmer of her pale, powdered face glancing back at her like a ghost in the silver. She does not smile. She rarely does in these moments, but she watches herself as her ladies pin her hair beneath the warm, scented wig. They are careful not to tug. They have been trained in silence. Every movement is practiced and gentle, a choreography of brushes and pins and powders. The wig today is auburn. Not her natural shade, though in youth her hair was said to shine like burnished copper. But time has faded it, thinned it. So she wears wigs now, elaborate and towering, curled and padded and pinned with pearl combs. Beneath it, her real hair is oiled and dusted with a fine blend of herbs and starch. This helps absorb sweat, prevents odor, keeps the scalp dry, a form of washing without water, because you must remember, water to Elizabeth was a danger, a temptation of the flesh, a source of disease. So she did what most did. She covered, she layered, she masked. Once the hair is secured and the skin powdered, the scenting begins. A dab of rosewater behind the ears, a stroke of civet at the wrists, amber grease on the handkerchief, folded just so, and tucked into her bodice. These were not light fragrances. They were heady, musky, thick with warmth. To us, they might feel overwhelming, but to Elizabeth and to those around her, they were divine, proof of refinement, evidence of favor. Fragrance was political. To smell like the queen was to show loyalty. To smell differently was to risk disgrace. And so even the courtiers wore heavy perfume. It clung to their gloves, their cuffs, their beards and bodices. When Elizabeth walked into a room, the air shifted. You could not help but notice. Not because of her voice, though it was sharp. Not because of her dress, though it sparkled. But because she brought with her the scent of sovereign power. A smell that lingered long after the conversation ended. Her clothes, too, played a part in her hygiene. Gowns were rarely washed. Instead, they were brushed, beaten, and aired. Linen shifts were changed daily, sometimes twice if she perspired. But the gowns, silk, brocade, velvet were treated with greater care. Soap could damage them, water could warp them. So they were kept clean with sachets of dried herbs tucked into the folds. Lavender, thyme, orris root, sometimes a little crushed mint or sage. These sachets warded off insects and gave the gowns their sweetness. In between wearings, her dresses were hung in cedar closets or laid across chairs near the fire, where their folds could warm and loosen. Sometimes maids would lay slices of lemon peel between the seams, not to disinfect, but to freshen, to lift, to confuse the nose into believing all was clean. And so the queen dressed not just in beauty, but in intention. Hygiene was a layered ritual. First came the shift soft, white, pressed with starch. Then the farthingale, a stiff petticoat made of hoops to shape the gown. Then the corset tight, whalebone laced, meant to sculpt her torso. Then the sleeves, the stomacher, the bodice, all arranged with care, with silence, with slow, practiced motion. Everything in its place. Everything powdered, perfumed, preserved. The final touch was always the ruff. That grand, starched collar white, wide, rippled like the edge of a clamshell. It framed her face, lifted her chin, declared her untouchable. Ruffs were soaked in starch and ironed into place with hot poking sticks, curled one frill at a time. They were impractical, yes, but elegant. And they protected the neck, not from weather, not from blades, but from sweat, from the smell of others, from the press of flesh. Elizabeth, you see, did not embrace, not often, not casually. Physical touch was rare in her court, reserved, controlled. Even in affection, she kept distance. A hand brushed across a cheek, a gloved palm to the shoulder, but nothing more. The body was sacred, fragile, easily corrupted, especially a woman's, and so she wore her cleanliness like armor. When she left her chambers and stepped into court, she appeared immaculate, untouchable, like a marble statue come to life. But underneath, her skin was powdered. Her scalp itched from starch. Her teeth ached. Her gums bled. Her stomach was sometimes sour from oils and herbs used to calm the nerves. And her body was tired, because her hygiene was not about comfort. It was about control and illusion. The illusion that she, unlike others, did not sweat, did not age, did not suffer, and certainly did not stink. But of course she did. Everyone did. Even the queen. The palace corridors were long and drafty, lined with tapestries to trap warmth and muffle footsteps. The floors, though scrubbed with vinegar and strewn with rushes, never lost their faint scent of damp stone and old smoke. In these halls, Queen Elizabeth moved like a painting come to life, elegant, upright, untouchable. Behind her trailed ladies, clerks, guards, and scent. Always the scent, rose, musk, and powder. The perfume of monarchy. But what most never saw, what existed only behind drawn curtains and bolted doors, was the effort beneath that fragrance. The endless, gentle rituals that maintained the queen's illusion of purity in a world where water was feared and filth lingered in every shadow. You see, while she rarely bathed, Elizabeth was deeply obsessed with avoiding odor. She would speak of it plainly, how she detested the sourness of unwashed men, how she turned her head when courtiers breathed too close. And so she created a world of barriers: fragrant gloves, herb-stuffed pouches, linen layers, and perhaps most importantly, the ritual of fumigation. In the 16th century, bad smells were not just unpleasant, they were feared. The popular medical theory of the time was miasma, the belief that disease spread through foul air. To smell something rotten was to risk illness. To breathe in filth was to breathe in plague. And so the queen's rooms were filled with protections. Her bedchamber was routinely smoked with incense, frankincense, myrrh, dried rosemary, cedar. Braziers placed in corners warmed the air and filled it with spice. Her writing desk had a small drawer built to hold a piece of perfumed linen, so even her letters bore her scent. When she visited nobles, they rushed to cleanse their homes, not with soap, but with scent. Herbs hung from ceilings. Floors were swept with rosewater. Stools and chairs were rubbed with clove oil, all in preparation for her presence. And when she traveled, Elizabeth carried her own comforts. Scented pomanders, small, round containers filled with herbs and spices, were tied to her waist or tucked into her sleeves. They worked as both perfume and protection, pressed close to her skin like whispered prayers. Some were carved from gold, others from bone or ivory. Inside, nutmeg, cinnamon, crushed mint, rose petals, vinegar-soaked sponges. The scent was intense, sharp, like medicine and flowers all at once, but it masked the truth. And in her world, that was what mattered most. Her court, too, became an extension of this scented rule. Cleanliness was not just encouraged, it was expected. Anyone who smelled too strongly of sweat, fish, ale, or horses might be dismissed without a word. Ambassadors were warned. Servants were scolded. Even members of Parliament took pains to powder their wigs and press herbs into their cuffs, because to smell bad before the Queen was treason of a quieter kind. But even with all this care, accidents happened. There were times, especially in summer, when the palace grew too warm, when the stench of hundreds of bodies, sweating, eating, breathing in close quarters, overpowered even the strongest perfumes. In those moments, Elizabeth would retreat. She would disappear into her private rooms, her presence replaced by sachets and fans, and when she returned renewed, re-scented, re-armored. There is one account, whispered in the papers, of a Spanish envoy, of the Queen fainting during a summer session, not from heat, but from the smell of unwashed courtiers. Whether true or not, the story lingered. A lesson, a warning, a reminder that in this court, scent was power, and Elizabeth wielded it like a blade. Even her punishments were scented. It's said she once dismissed a lady-in-waiting for allowing her hands to smell of onions. Another was sent home for wearing too much musk, a scent the Queen found vulgar. She preferred balance, soft florals, herbal blends, nothing that shouted, nothing that tried too hard. Her own blend was carefully chosen, never overwhelming, but always present, enough to mark a room, enough to fill a silence. And so, day after day, Elizabeth maintained her illusion, not with soap, not with scrubbing, but with precision and ritual. Cloths warmed by fire, gloves perfumed by hand, teeth rubbed raw with crushed herbs, skin powdered pale with lead, hair dressed with starch and oil, gowns brushed and scented and aired. Cleanliness in her world was not the removal of dirt. It was the art of never appearing dirty. And she was a master. Even in old age, when her health waned, when her teeth loosened and her hands trembled, she refused to let the image slip. She added more powder, more fragrance, more silence. By then, her attendants knew the routines by heart, knew how to sponge her face without pressing too hard, how to set the sheets before she entered the bed, how to sprinkle dried petals between the folds of her undergown. No detail was too small, because this queen, above all, believed in mastery of the self, and in her scented stillness, she ruled. Outside the palace, the streets of London were foul and loud. In the gutters, refuse from market stalls spilled into the mud vegetable peels, spoiled meat, the runoff of chamber pots emptied from windows above. The air clung to skin like smoke. And yet, just beyond the city gates, inside the walls of court, Queen Elizabeth created a world that defied it all. A world where the scent of rot dared not enter, where flowers hung like sentries and every hand that passed her bore the faint, sharp trace of something fragrant. Even time, it seemed, moved more slowly here. In the afternoons, the queen would often retreat to her privy chamber, a private suite where only her most trusted companions were allowed. It was smaller than the grand halls and far quieter. The windows were narrow and high. The light was soft. A fire always burned in the grate, and cushions were piled high around the walls. Here she might read or sew, or simply sit in silence while her attendants tended to the invisible work of presence, brushing sleeves, warming slippers, airing the handkerchiefs by the window. It was a place of constant, quiet motion, like the gentle shifting of silk on skin. And still, the scent never faded, because every hour it was renewed. A fresh cloth soaked in orange water, a dab of balm beneath the ear, a drop of myrtle oil on the wrist, all done slowly, softly, repeating the rituals that whispered, "The queen is clean, the queen is pure, the queen is untouchable." Even her writing supplies carried her scent. Letters were sealed with wax scented with crushed cloves. The quills she used were sometimes rubbed with rose oil, so the ink would carry the faintest floral trace. Recipients of her letters would lift the parchment to their nose and breathe in as if inhaling part of her spirit. Because cleanliness in Elizabeth's world was not about health, It was about presence, about power, about the lasting impression left behind when the room fell silent. And in this private world where even silence had a scent, her servants worked with practiced grace. The linen woman kept detailed records of each shift, each pallor, each pair of gloves worn and retired. If a scent faded, she knew. If a stain appeared, she replaced it. There was no room for error. A soiled handkerchief left too long could result in punishment, and a poorly powdered ruff could draw her icy glare. For Elizabeth, every detail mattered. Even her bed was scented. Each morning before the Queen returned to it, her sheets were shaken out and misted with lavender water. Dried rosemary and chamomile were tucked between the folds. In winter, the mattress was warmed with a pan of coals placed beneath it. But always the bedding had to smell clean. Not necessarily be clean, but seem so. The illusion of freshness was enough. And then there were her shoes. Shoes for Elizabeth were not just protection from cold stone. They were another layer in her hygiene, lined with herbs, wiped daily with vinegar and oil. In summer, the soles were dusted with a mixture of crushed rose petals and chalk, meant to absorb moisture and leave behind a trail of subtle sweetness. She would never see the streets beyond her gates, but even in her courtyards, she walked as though her feet might kiss the air. And yet, she knew the truth. She knew that beneath the powder and perfume, her body was just that, a body, that her teeth were loosening, that her gums bled at night, that sometimes no scent could mask the pain of age. Her hands, once smooth, had begun to spot. Her hair had thinned to soft gray wisps, but none of it showed, because she would not let it. In moments of solitude, she might sit at her mirror and lift the veil of powder just for a breath, look into her own eyes, feel the ache in her joints, smell, perhaps faintly, the edge of sourness creeping beneath the perfume. And then she would cover it again, brush by brush, layer by layer, because to rule, she believed, was to be above decay, to be more than mortal, to be clean. Evening at court arrived not with chimes or clocks, but with the slow dimming of light across polished stone and tapestry. The shadows grew longer. Candles were lit one by one, their flames catching on brass holders and throwing soft gold against the queen's embroidered gowns. The scent in the chamber shifted to no longer sharp like rosemary or bright with lemon, but heavier, like sandalwood, beeswax, and warmed rose petals soaked in wine. It was a different kind of cleanliness, the kind meant to soothe the senses, to soften the edges of the day. As Elizabeth prepared for the evening hours, she did not remove her layers in haste. Each pin, each ribbon, each fastening of silk or lace was undone with care. She had spent decades perfecting the art of unmaking herself, and though her body was tired by now, though her bones ached from the corset's grip, and her shoulders felt heavy beneath the velvet weight of power, she did not collapse. She yielded with dignity. The maidservants worked in practiced rhythm, catching the queen's gaze in the mirror to know when to pause. They would unlace her sleeves and gently ease the fabric from her arms. Beneath the layers, her linen shift clung lightly to her skin damp at the underarms, yellowing at the neckline, faintly marked by perfume and powder that had settled through the day. But to the queen, this was not shameful. It was expected. Her attendants would whisk the shift away and replace it with another soft, warm, freshly pressed, and scented with chamomile steam. For her face, a separate ritual began. A basin of warm rainwater was brought in, laced with rosemary and marigold. A clean cloth, never reused, was dipped and gently passed across her cheeks, her chin, her brow. The lead-based powder, thick and pale, lifted in slow streaks. Behind it, her real skin emerged redder, blotched, weathered, older, more human. Her eyes closed during this process, not from shame, but from habit, as though if she didn't see herself unmasked, she could still believe the image she had projected all day. After cleansing came balm, a mixture of beeswax, almond oil, and rose, pressed lightly into the cheeks, the forehead, the backs of her hands. It softened the skin, soothed the irritation left by powder and sun and courtly tension. The scent was delicate, like something remembered from childhood, distant and soft. It did not cover, it comforted. Next came her hair, or what remained of it. In her later years, Elizabeth's own hair had grown thin and brittle from decades of wigs and powders. Each evening, her remaining locks were gently combed with ivory teeth, oiled with spikenard or clove, then carefully wrapped in a linen scarf. The wig, once removed, was brushed and set aside. It, too, had its own case lined with sachets of dried herbs. Even false hair was to be kept pure in her world. And then, finally, came the feet. After a long day of standing, pacing, and ceremony, her slippers were removed, and her feet bathed not in a tub, but in a shallow basin lined with pebbles and herbs. The water was warm, always warm. Into it went handfuls of marjoram, mint, and sometimes milk. The ritual was soothing, not simply cleansing, but grounding. As her feet soaked, her breathing slowed. Her voice softened, and for a moment, perhaps, she was no longer Queen Elizabeth, but simply Elizabeth, a woman alone at the end of a long day, weary, aging, and wrapped in fragrance like a second skin. She would sometimes speak then, low murmurs to her ladies, bits of poetry, memory, names of friends long gone, of her mother, Anne Boleyn, of her youth when her hair had needed no powder, and her smile no veil. She would reach for her pomander and press it to her lips, not to scent the room, but to remember who she was beneath the weight of rule. And when the basin was taken away and the hearth allowed to burn low, she would settle into bed. The sheets, fresh from the linen press, carried the scent of lavender and wood smoke. A warm stone wrapped in cloth was placed at her feet. A book might rest on the knit stand, and beside her always a small bowl of dried petals and salt to catch bad dreams. Sleep for the queen came slowly. She did not close her eyes quickly. She drifted between scent and silence, between memory and mask, between the woman she was and the figure the world believed her to be. And as the candle burned to its final stub, the last scent she breathed was her own, clean, composed, and impossibly still. In the deepest hour of night, the palace was a different place entirely. Gone were the voices and velvet shoes, the music and murmured flattery. Gone were the courtiers with their powdered faces and jewel-toned gloves. The tapestries hung still now, heavy with sleep. The torches along the corridors had burned down to orange embers, casting long, twitching shadows across the floors. Only the soft crackle of a dying hearth reminded the night staff that life still stirred somewhere inside the walls. Even the bells had gone silent, and in the queen's chamber she lay very still beneath her covers. She had not bathed today, nor the day before, nor the week before that, and still she was clean in her way. Her skin smelled faintly of roses and orris root, her bed linens of lavender and lye. Her fingers, even in sleep, curled slightly inward, the nails neatly trimmed, rubbed with a salve of beeswax and lemon peel that helped keep the cuticles soft. Her feet, now warm and tucked beneath thick wool blankets, still carried the memory of the evening's herb soak. Even sleep, for her, was a curated ritual. But elsewhere in the palace, the scent of the day still lingered. In the corridors, where the rushes had been scattered and swept and scattered again. In the kitchens, where meat had been roasted, pies pinched closed with sugar and spice. In the privies, where lye and ashes were thrown over waste but never quite masked the smell. Even the chapel, where candles burned in thick beeswax coils, had its own scent wax, smoke, worn wool, polished pews. Hygiene in Elizabeth's time was not about removal. It was about layering, about managing the air around you, about crafting a bubble of fragrance that kept the outside world at bay. And the Queen had mastered it. Every morning, her linen woman would inspect the garments from the night before, not for dirt, but for scent. If the shift carried a sourness too strong, it was boiled with rosemary. If the ruff smelled too much of powder and breath, it was re-starched and laid flat beside bundles of lavender. Gloves were hung near the hearth to dry, stockings dusted with powdered alum and left in cedar drawers. Everything preserved, everything prepared. Even the tools of her hygiene were scented. Her combs, carved from ivory and horn, were sometimes rubbed with oils, not just for shine, but to discourage lice. Her brushes were cleaned weekly with vinegar and herbs. Her sponges used to dab her face or moisten her eyes were steeped in chamomile water and left to dry in the sun. No object touched her skin without first being soft, scented, approved. But what is perhaps most fascinating is how normal this was. Elizabeth's cleanliness was not unique to royalty. It was simply the royal version of a practice observed by all who could afford it. In Tudor England, cleanliness did not mean water. It meant linen. It meant herbs. It meant powders and airings and the art of not allowing smell to take root. The poor might change their shirt once a week, the rich once a day, and the Queen twice if needed. Her physicians believed that bathing opened the pores, made the body vulnerable. The skin, after a bath, might let in cold air, might draw sickness into the lungs or the blood. Better to dry wash, better to sponge with spirits or rose water, better to keep the body sealed, preserved, wrapped in layers of fabric and fragrance. And so Elizabeth lived most of her life in a world without soap, as we know it. The soap that existed then was harsh, made of lye and animal fat. It stripped the skin, it left a residue. It was used sparingly, if at all, and never on the Queen's face. Instead, she relied on powders white lead for coverage, starch for her ruffs, crushed pearls for brightness. The powders absorbed oils. They prevented shine. They were reapplied throughout the day, sometimes with a puff, sometimes with a soft cloth. In portraits, her skin glows with an otherworldly light. Pale, smooth, perfect, but beneath that surface, her skin struggled. Irritation, rash, redness. The powder that made her radiant also poisoned her slowly. Over time, it hardened the skin, made it flake, gave her the look of statues timeless but distant. She bore it all with grace, because to Elizabeth, image was everything. And image began with presence, and presence with scent. By morning, the scent of the palace had shifted again. Overnight, the fire had burned low, leaving only a faint trace of ash on the hearthstones. The herb-soaked linens cooling at the window had lost some of their strength, but they still held their shape stiff, pale, folded with precision like pressed petals. And the air was quiet, expectant, as if it knew the queen would soon awaken and bring with her the first hint of rose water and musk, of lavender-laced linen and almond balm. Long before she stirred, her servants had begun again. The linen woman stood barefoot on the rush-strewn floor, selecting the day's underlayers with care. Always white, always fresh. The shifts, though simple in appearance, were considered the true guardians of cleanliness. Made from tightly woven linen, they sat close to the skin, absorbing sweat, oil, and perfume. These were changed daily, sometimes twice on hot days, while the grander outer garments, heavy with embroidery and gold-threaded seams, were brushed and re-scented instead of washed. And this, to Elizabeth, was enough, because in her time, linen was magic. It was believed that clean linen drew impurities from the body, that it wicked away the invisible things that caused odor and sickness. And so rather than wash her body with water, the queen changed her linens, layered them, let the fabric carry the burden of the day. Some of her shifts were so fine they were nearly transparent, woven so tightly they felt cool against the skin, even in summer. They were soaked with herbs before being worn, sometimes chamomile, sometimes rose, or simply aired in the sun until they held the freshness of the gardens beyond her chamber. And gardens were no small thing in Elizabeth's world. Her court gardeners were tasked not only with cultivating beauty, but with supplying her apothecaries. They harvested rose petals before dawn, when their scent was strongest. They cut rosemary and thyme, bundled and hung in the drying rooms. Lavender was crushed, distilled, dried, and sewn into sachets. Mint was steeped in vinegar for cooling cloths. Even marigold golden and simple was used to brighten water and scent her handkerchiefs. All of this, every flower, every leaf, was part of her daily script of cleanliness, because to rule was to remain unspoiled, and the world outside the palace was far from pure. London was a living body, its breath thick with smoke and sewage, its skin covered in soot and grime. Water from the Thames was often brown, filled with refuse and rot. Soap was harsh. Towels were coarse. Few had the luxury of daily linen, let alone fragrant gloves or herbal sachets. To walk through the markets was to wade through the scent of fish, blood, wool, tallow, manure, and humanity. And yet, within her palace, Elizabeth built another world, a scented kingdom, a place where even the stones beneath her feet were brushed with crushed mint before her slippers touched them. Visitors often commented on it. Ambassadors would describe her in letters as scented like spring rain, or wrapped in air as sweet as violets. They marveled not just at her intellect or political mastery, but at how clean she seemed, how untouched by the filth outside her gates. But this was no accident. It was effort, constant, quiet, invisible effort, and it was exhausting. There were days, especially in her later years, when Elizabeth would retreat for hours behind her velvet-curtained bed, behind drawn shutters and closed doors, not for illness, not for grief, but simply to rest from the pressure of purity, to allow herself, if only for a moment, to sit with her own scent, to breathe without masks, to let the oils fade, the powder crack, the rough go unstarched. She did not allow visitors during these times, not even her most trusted ladies. Instead, she sat alone with a single burning taper and a basin of warm water, not to bathe, but to steam, to rest her feet, to soak a cloth and press it to her neck, to feel quietly what it meant to be without being seen. Then, slowly, the rituals would begin again, because to stop was to be seen as weak. And Elizabeth would rather, as the Queen aged, the rituals only deepened. Where once she had simply dabbed her wrists with balm, now she required layers, multiple cloths, oils applied in sequence, scents rotated with the seasons, not for novelty, but to keep the body guessing, to stay ahead of the flesh, because age, even for a monarch, carried its own fragrance, a dryness to the skin, a sourness beneath the perfume, a warmth behind the ears that powder could not always hide. But Elizabeth was not one to let nature win. She adapted, expanded her practices, reinvented her image again and again, like a page rewritten until no trace of the original ink remained. And scent, always scent, was her companion in the process. Now her pomanders grew larger, sometimes fastened to long chains, swinging gently at her side like a sacred relic. Their contents became more complex. Shavings of sandalwood, dried lemon peel, cinnamon bark, violet root, even tobacco leaves wrapped in cloth. Her gloves were sent back to be re-perfumed every fortnight, soaked in spirits and crushed herbs pressed flat, and returned in boxes lined with rose petals. And still it was never quite enough. There is a quiet truth that lives behind every heavy scent. It is not a mark of vanity, but of fear. A fear that the body might betray you, that it might reveal what the court was never meant to see, that underneath the silk and ceremony, the Queen was just a woman, aging, aching, real. At night, she would sometimes sit longer at her mirror. The flame from the candle revealed not the powdered mask, but the skin beneath, spotted, lined, touched by time. She would lift her chin and study herself with eyes as sharp as ever, and for a moment there might be no movement, just breath, just the faint, lingering scent of lily and cloves clinging to her night rail. Then she would reach for the cloth, a cloth soaked in balm or wine or chamomile water different each week. Press it gently beneath the jaw, the temples, the hollows beneath the eyes. She would blot, not scrub, tap, not rub. Everything was a caress. The body by now was delicate. Bruising came easily. But the effort continued, because to sleep unscented was to give in, and so the sheets remained fragrant. Each week her linen press was opened and sorted. Shifts for daily wear, gowns for court, night garments. And always her bed linens pressed flat and stored between layers of lavender, orris root, and a touch of angelica. When the sheets were laid down for her each night, her chambermaids moved slowly, smoothing each edge, puffing the pillows, tucking dried herbs near the seams. The air above her mattress was warmer than the rest of the room, touched by the pan of coals that had heated the underside before her arrival. This was not luxury. It was preservation. Heat kept the body from chilling. Fragrance kept the dreams clean. Her dreams mattered. The Queen believed in signs, in portents, in messages from sleep, and she believed that foul smells, miasmas invited bad dreams, let in evil thoughts. So the air around her bed had to be sweet, still, controlled. A chambermaid once described walking into Elizabeth's sleeping chamber, and feeling as though she'd stepped into a garden at dusk, cool, dim, and thick with scent, like nothing she'd ever known. Even in slumber, the queen ruled through presence, and in the morning, when her eyes opened, she did not stretch or yawn or groan. She simply began again. The claws, the oils, the powdered starch, the scented gloves, the bodice drawn tight and the face made smooth. A return to silence, a return to the illusion that she had not aged, that she did not sweat, that she was sovereign not only by blood but by mastery of her body. She did not bathe, she transformed, and the world, breathing her in, believed it. Some days the queen remained unseen. No court appearances, no walks in the gallery, no signatures, no audience. On such days the palace soft its rhythm. Footsteps became gentler, voices lowered. The hearth in her chamber burned slower, the light golden and muted across her walls of velvet and oak. These were her private day's moments of retreat beneath the surface of ceremony, when Elizabeth lived as few imagined, in quiet, in fragrance, in observation. She still rose early, but instead of her coronation gown or her state jewels, she chose linen. Layers of it soft and pressed, warmed near the fire, folded with sachets of crushed violets and dried rosemary. The scent filled the chamber long before she spoke a word. She would be wrapped in this linen like a cocoon, as though holding still in time, a private sanctuary of scent. Her attendants knew these days well. They did not bring state papers or polished gloves. They brought bowls of steaming herbs, cloths scented with wine, and combs made from smooth ivory. Her hair, such as remained, was carefully unbound, brushed with the quiet rhythm of habit. Her scalp was touched with oil, sometimes thyme, sometimes bay leaf massaged, in slow, circling strokes that made her eyes close not from sleep, but from memory. These were the rituals that brought her peace. No speeches, no ambassadors, just the hush of fabric and flame and the scent of fennel rising from a simmering bowl at the foot of her bed. And it is in these moments that we understand her best. Not the queen dressed in diamonds, but the woman beneath, who understood that purity was not about being untouched by dirt, but about never letting the world see it. Who understood that to control her scent was to control how close others could get. To manage the very air around her was to manage perception. And to live like this every day was not vanity. It was survival, because a woman's power in her time was always under scrutiny. One wrinkle, one blemish, one slip of scent, and the whispers would begin that she was fading, that she was sick, that the virgin queen was no longer immune to time. So she prepared every inch of her body with care, not because she feared death, but because she refused to be dismissed by it. Even her fingernails, so small a detail, were managed, rubbed with oils, sometimes stained with a thin gloss made from crushed berries and wax, not to color, but to hide the dullness of age. Her fingertips carried the faint scent of lemon verbena and myrrh, so when she passed letters to her secretaries, even the parchment bore her trace, and the letters themselves were scented. She would not allow her words to arrive stained or plain. Instead, her letters were folded with lavender or sealed with wax that had been steeped in rose water. Some said they carried her presence with them, that the scent remained on a letter for weeks, a reminder to the reader of who she was, fragrant, powerful, ever-present. The myth of her purity was not built overnight. It was laid like brickwork, layer upon scented layer, pressed into cloth and balm and smoke, until even she began to believe it. That perhaps she was more than flesh. That perhaps the oils and powders weren't hiding her humanity, but transforming it, making her something else, something eternal. She once told her ladies that a queen must not be smelled before she is seen. A curious phrase, and yet it reveals everything. Her scent was not just camouflage, it was advance warning, announcement, invitation and boundary all in one. To smell like Elizabeth was to remember her, even when she was gone. And so even when she sat alone in her chamber, no audience, no court, she remained scented. She remained dressed, layered, managed, because to let the illusion fade even for a day was to risk everything. As the seasons changed, so too did the queen's scents. Spring brought lighter oils, citrus peels, and marjoram, the green stems of crushed hyacinth and violet. Her linens were steamed with lemon balm and thyme. In summer, the warmth in her chamber became heavy with floral powder and starch, enough to weigh on the breath. Autumn came with clove, nutmeg, a trace of cinnamon, and smoke curling softly from the hearth. And in winter, everything thickened bitter myrrh, dried orange peel, the clean ache of pine resin. Her world was a calendar of fragrance. This rotation was deliberate, not just a matter of preference, but of health, so believed the physicians of the age. Each season had its own humors, and balancing those humors through smell was considered wise, almost medicinal. In winter, for example, warm scents were believed to guard against the phlegmatic chill. In summer, cooling floral waters were meant to calm the hot temperaments. And the queen, ever a creature of control, followed this doctrine, not blindly, but with fine-tuned awareness. She adjusted her perfumes accordingly. She stored her linen with season-appropriate herbs. She even requested that her food be flavored with the same scents that lined her sleeves: mint, marjoram, rosemary. To dine with Elizabeth was to enter another kind of perfumed chamber. Roasted quail glazed with rose honey, custards with orange blossom, scented wine steeped with violets. Even the napkins, folded delicately on trays of silver, were soaked in scented water and pressed smooth, so her fingertips might never touch fabric that had gone dry. It was not merely about avoiding bad smells. It was about continuity, the experience of scent extending from the chamber to the table, from her gloves to her goblet, because scent was how the queen moved through the world without leaving it behind. Those who attended her closely were trained in this continuity. Her linen maid, her gentlewoman, her apothecary, they formed a secret council of caretakers, invisible to the public eye. They moved through the palace like shadows. They knew how to apply starch to a ruff without making it stiff, how to re-scent gloves without staining the lining, how to prepare a basin of floral water with precisely the amount of warmth her skin could bear. They knew how she liked her towels folded, how her toothpicks were to be soaked, how the rushes beneath her feet should be changed if the scent of smoke clung to them too long, because every part of her body had a scent protocol, even her mouth. Elizabeth's dental care was advanced by the standards of her age, though still difficult by modern reckoning. She used cloths soaked in wine or vinegar to clean her teeth, which were beginning to decay from sweet wines and candied fruits. Her gums bled. Her breath was not always sweet, but still she fought to maintain the illusion. She chewed sprigs of mint or fennel. Her apothecaries prepared paste made from burnt rosemary and powdered alabaster, rubbed gently across her teeth by her most trusted lady. When she spoke deliberately, slowly, she paused often to wet her lips with balm. And when she smiled, it was measured, tight-lipped, preserved like a portrait behind glass. The people never saw her unguarded. That was the secret. Even her moments of weakness, illness, grief, fear were filtered through scent and silence. When she mourned the death of her trusted advisor, Sir Francis Walsingham, she retreated into her chamber and refused to eat. But even then she demanded that her sheets be changed, her hands bathed, her sleeves freshened. Her grief did not mean she would smell of it. And when she faced rebellion, sickness in the court, threats from abroad, still she emerged fragrant. Because if she smelled of roses, how could she possibly be losing? If she smelled of lavender, how could her enemies suspect fear? To smell clean was to appear untouched. To appear untouched was to remain sovereign. and she would never surrender that power. By the final decade of her reign, the Queen was more scent than skin. Every hallway she passed through, every glove she slipped off, every handkerchief she left behind, whispered of her presence. The essence of Elizabeth lingered in brocade and scrollwork, in sealed letters and candlelit corridors. She was not just remembered, she was inhaled. And that was exactly what she wanted. Because her power now was not the same as it had been in youth. The vigor of youth had passed. Her limbs moved slower. Her face, though masked by powders, bore the strain of time. She had grown thin, her gowns altered again and again to fit her changing shape. Her voice, once clear and commanding, had grown dry and quiet, like the soft scrape of paper. But her scent had not faded. In fact, it had grown sharper, more calculated. A blend now of musk and orris, clove and crushed iris root, oil of storax and the rare essence of ambergris, a strange perfume, neither wholly floral nor earthy. Something eternal, something unsettling. Something like royalty distilled into aroma. To be near her was to step into a world outside time. Even her throne was scented. The cushions were aired in sun and dusted with powdered herbs. The wood was polished with beeswax and lavender oil. Her robes, before being draped across her shoulders, were warmed over coals infused with orange peel and myrtle. A priest once remarked that kneeling before her felt like kneeling before a garden flame. Something alive and holy, something not quite real. That was the goal. Because Elizabeth no longer competed with beauty, she surpassed it. She no longer charmed by speech, she enveloped by scent. She no longer fought with youth, she replaced it with myth. And the center of that myth was silence. For all the words that surrounded her in court and letters, entreaties and proclamations, her truest language was fragrance. It was how she controlled her space. It was how she answered questions she did not want to speak aloud. A heavier perfume meant she was displeased. A light scent of lily meant her mood was lifted. Her closest ladies learned to interpret her like a code. One visitor noted that the Queen entered rooms before she arrived, that her perfume would announce her, blooming through the corridors like smoke drifting ahead of fire. But the fire never came. Only the Queen, silent, pale, eternal. And when she passed, the scent remained behind, folding over tapestries and sleeves, settling into the seams of the building like memory. Even after she left the room, People felt watched, and so by the end of her life the queen no longer needed to speak often. Her presence did the work, her gloves, her linens, her scent trailing behind her like a second self. She had become a kind of relic, part woman, part ghost, part living portrait. And the scent never lied. When she was angry, the perfume grew spicier. When she was ill, her balms grew thicker, heavier, musky, and metallic. When she mourned, she wore no perfume, it all lay rosewater and starch, clean and stripped, a silence made fragrant. Her silence, too, had notes, tonalities, layers of lavender and absence. It was said that her death was not believed at first, that when the news spread, many at court paused not in grief, but in confusion. They could still smell her. Her chambers still bore her breath. Her linens, untouched, still carried her wrist's perfume. Her gloves hung still in the alcove near her bed. Her letters still gave off violet and orris when opened. The queen was gone. And yet she wasn't, because she had left herself behind in the air. She had made sure of it. After her death, the palace did not know what to do with her scent. It lingered like breath trapped in fabric, resisting wind and time. The apothecaries kept their bottles sealed, unsure whether to preserve or release. The linen women handled her shifts with gloves, folding them not with grief but reverence. Even the furniture, even the rushes on the floor seemed to hesitate, no longer in service, yet still steeped in her. The chambermaids noticed it most. They were the ones who had powdered her pillows, changed her linens, refreshed her gloves. They had known the exact measure of balm for her wrists, the way she liked her sleeves folded after steaming, the sound of her breath when she pressed a cloth to her face before bed. And now the room waited, full of that same softness, but without her body to give it motion. A ghost of routine. They didn't wash the sheets right away, not out of forgetfulness, but because they couldn't. The scent was hers, and in it she was still present. To open the windows felt like betrayal. To scatter the dried rosemary on the rushes felt like scattering her memory. The queen had ruled for so long, shaped the air itself so thoroughly, that even in her absence, her essence remained. But time, as it always does, began to press forward. A new monarch, new fragrances, new routines. And still, the ghosts of Elizabeth's scent lingered in corners. When they stripped the velvet from her bed, the dried petals stitched into its seams fell like soft snow. When they opened her trunks, the sachets of orris and amber crumbled into powder, releasing one final breath of memory. Even her wigs, still curled on their stands, held the faint scent of clove and starch, as if waiting to be placed atop her head once more. Nothing had ever been thrown away during her reign. Old gloves were boxed, dried soaps wrapped in silk and saved, stained linen repurposed into handkerchiefs or cleaning cloths, then stored with herbs until they, too, became pleasant. Her entire household was a cycle of reuse, not out of thrift, but out of reverence for fragrance. Nothing was allowed to rot. Nothing was allowed to sour. Even waste was managed with ritual. So when the time came to close the room, the final time her staff did not weep, they aired the chambers with rosemary smoke. They folded the linens into cedar chests. They pressed her gloves flat and tied them with ribbons. And they placed a sprig of lavender on the threshold, a closing breath. For a queen who had ruled not only by sword and state, but by scent. And outside, the world moved on. The city changed. The perfumes shifted. Cleanliness evolved. But Elizabeth remained a legend not just for her policies or power, but for how she defied decay. How she built an entire system of being clean without water, of being present without touch, of being remembered through the air itself. Even now, her letters carry the rumor of violet. Even now, museums preserve her gloves in glass, scentless but suggestive. Even now, in certain old corridors of ancient palaces, visitors sometimes pause, breathe in, and claim softly they smelled something like roses and wood smoke, something faint, something royal. and so the queen became scent. Where others left statues or portraits, Elizabeth left behind a trail of trace aromas documented, described, catalogued in whispered memory and parchment. Her contemporaries wrote not only of her words, but of her presence. She smelled of frankincense and fallen leaves, of lily touched by sun, of something holy. Even when her decisions stirred unrest, even when her temper flared and her court grew tense, it was her scent that grounded her legend. Never frantic, never spoiled, always measured, controlled. This careful composition was its own form of armor. Where men wore steel and chain, she wore rose and amber. The armor of softness, the shield of stillness. And for decades it worked. She was rarely touched, never held without her permission, never approached without preparation. Her body remained her own through scent. Even lovers, if there were any, would have found themselves approaching a carefully orchestrated illusion, not a vulnerable woman. But behind the layers of scent and linen and ceremonial distance, Elizabeth was still flesh. And her flesh, though rarely spoken of, bore the quiet burdens of her time: aching joints, tooth decay, tired feet, wrapped nightly in wool and balm, fingertips that cracked in winter despite constant oiling, eyes that strained beneath the weight of coal and candlelight. Her comfort came not from being untouched by these things, but from hiding them so completely. There was something priest-like in her routines. Each ritual, each application of balm or brushing of linen was a kind of sacred act, not vanity, devotion, as if to say, this body is the kingdom, and it must remain untouched. The body was both temple and theater, and its scent, the incense that made belief possible. And so even on her final days, her maids performed the rites. When Elizabeth no longer rose from her cushions, they still pressed clean linen to her skin. They changed her sleeves. They brushed her fingers with sweet almond. They lit rosemary in the corner of her room, not to cover decay, but to honor continuity. She was no longer speaking, no longer ruling, and yet the air around her remained composed, controlled, sweet, as if she herself were not dying, but evaporating, drifting slowly into the realm of air and memory, into perfume and parchment, into silence. No one dared stop the rituals. No one dared open a window. And when she finally passed, it was said the room did not grow heavy or sour, but lighter. The scent lingered for hours, a closing hymn in fragrant air, and the world outside the palace kept breathing. Bathing changed. Soap became common. Fragrances evolved. But no monarch, no ruler, no queen ever again managed to bottle the myth of power quite the way Elizabeth did. Not by force, not by command, but through the quietest sense of all, scent. The one that lingers after the voice has faded, after the light has dimmed, after the footsteps have vanished into velvet hallways and dust. Long after her death, the question of her body remained. Not its burial, no, that was settled with state and silver, with procession and carved stone, but its care. How had it endured? How had it remained so seemingly untouched by the filth of its time? For scholars, the puzzle was not just Elizabeth's power, but how she kept it wrapped in purity, how she convinced a world of mud and soot and open sewers that she floated above it all. And the answer, of course, was in the scent. It was in the linen drawers, still labeled by day and season. It was in the recipe books of her apothecaries, carefully noting ratios of rose water to vinegar, how many pinches of marjoram, how long to boil a lemon peel in white wine. It was in the starch rooms where her ruffs were dried with sage leaves, tucked between their folds so that the stiffness would never crackle without sweetness. It was in the memory of her women, long gone now, but who once whispered in corridors about the Queen's quiet cough, the sudden tremble of her hand, the days when even fragrance could not mask her weariness. And yet the rituals never ceased. And it was in the gloves, always the gloves. Decades later, when collectors came into possession of items marked as hers velvet slippers, an ivory comb, a silver pomander, what most arrested them was not the fabric or craftsmanship, but the air. Many claimed the scent still lingered, a softness like powdered wood and faded petals that seemed too persistent to be imagined. Of course, time had changed it. The sharp notes had faded, the edges dulled, but there was something still embedded in the leather, in the stitching, something that whispered of the hand that had once warmed, the wrist it had once held. These gloves became relics, not because they touched power, but because they carried its aura. And it was the aura, the illusion, the atmosphere that Elizabeth curated more carefully than any crown. Because for all her intelligence, her political mastery, her speeches and letters, she knew what truly controlled a room was presence. And presence began not with sight or sound, but scent. That was her secret weapon, her ghost, her throne. And in her absence, that scent was what people missed the most. No one remembered the exact shade of her eyes. No one recalled the full rhythm of her voice, but the air around her, that floral hush, that starch and rose-water dream that lingered in memories like a hymn. And it was passed down softly from maid to maid, from letter to ledger, from bottle to glove. That's how a queen becomes legend, not through noise, but through the softest trace of presence, through the thing that cannot be seen, only sensed. And as the world changed, as revolutions shook palaces and monarchies rose and fell, there would always be, in some corner of a museum, a sealed glass case, and in that case a single glove, and pressed beneath the glass, a curl of white linen, and floating above it, if you lean in close enough, a trace of her, still. There is a kind of power that does not speak. It does not shout or strike. It does not march down marble steps or stand beneath banners. It simply fills a room, slowly, invisibly, like perfume unfolding from a warm cloth. Elizabeth understood this power. She studied it, refined it, and then she became it. Even now, we do not entirely know the ingredients she used. The recipes were guarded, scattered across forgotten pages and sealed bottles. Her personal apothecaries swore oaths, spoke little. The formulas passed on in part, sometimes misremembered, sometimes changed. A pinch too much of clove, a drop too little of civet, a different base oil. The scent becomes something else. Almost her, but not quite, because her true fragrance was never just about ingredients. It was time, it was ritual. It was fear and poise and memory wrapped in starch and lace and centuries of stillness. In many ways, her scent outlived her more than any portrait. A painting can be studied, restored, explained, but a scent, a true, lingering scent, cannot be traced. It hovers just out of reach. It touches the deepest part of the brain, the part that stores dreams, not facts. And so it slips past history and lands somewhere softer. That is where she lives now, in the quiet folds of forgotten fabric, and the brittle velvet pages of old ledgers, in the empty corridors where linen once hung in pressed stacks beside open windows, in the warm silence of museums at closing hour, when even the lights hesitate, and someone pauses before a glass case and swears for just a moment they caught the faintest scent of something regal, something powdery, something alive. They lean in, they close their eyes, and they feel not the roar of an empire, but the quiet sovereignty of a woman who ruled without letting the world see her sweat. It is in this stillness that she rests now, where the starch is crisp, the linen cool, the rose petals dry but intact, the gloves neatly folded, the mirrors covered, the air just sweet enough. And you, dear listener, have walked through her world, softly, quietly. With each breath, you've traced the ritual, the silk, the scent. You've walked beside her in the hush of morning. You've seen the cloth pressed beneath her eyes. You've felt the weight of a perfume-soaked glove resting beside a trembling hand. And now you can rest too, for the story has ended. The linens are folded. The fire is low, and the queen is asleep. At last,